Friedrich Nietzsche on the Genealogy of Morals, Part 1, Section 4. The signpost to the right road was for me the question, what was the real etymological significance of the designations for good coined in the various languages? I found they all led back to the same conceptual transformation, that everywhere noble, aristocratic in the social sense, is the basic concept from which good, in the sense of with aristocratic soul, noble, with a soul of a high order, with a privileged soul, necessarily developed. A development which always runs parallel with that other in which common, plebeian, low, are finally transformed into the concept bad. The most convincing example of the latter is the German word schlecht, bad, itself, which is identical with schlicht, plain or simple. Compare schlechtweg, plainly, schlechterdings, simply, and originally designated the plain, the common man, as yet with no inculpatory implication, and simply in contradistinction to the nobility. About the time of the 30 Years' War, late enough, therefore, this meaning changed into the one now customary. With regard to a moral genealogy, this seems to me a fundamental insight. That it has been arrived at so late is the fault of the retarding influence exercised by the democratic prejudice in the modern world toward all questions of origin. And this is so even in the apparently quite objective domain of natural science and physiology, as I shall merely hint here. But what mischief this prejudice is capable of doing, especially to morality and history, once it has been unbridled to the point of hatred, is shown by the notorious case of Buckle. Here, the plebeianism of the modern spirit, which is of English origin, erupted once again on its native soil as violently as a mud volcano, and with that salty, noisy, vulgar eloquence with which all volcanoes have spoken hitherto. Okay, so we can, let's begin with actually at the end here, this dig that he takes at the English. He's already been kind of ragging on the English psychologists, pointing out some of their shortcomings here. And here he does something that we're going to find him, I think, doing quite a lot throughout his writing. He tends to think of forms of stupidity as being linked with some kind of national identity. He'll often talk about, the stupidity of the Germans or Russian stupidity, or that kind of thing. And here he seems to be taking a jab at a particular kind of English stupidity, which he holds responsible for what he calls the plebeianism of the modern spirit. And he links it here with the historian Henry Thomas Buckle, who is considered to be a very, very influential sort of rationalist historian of the early 19th century, who exercised a very kind of materialist and scientific mode of investigation that eschewed any kind of, theological or predestinating force organizing history at the large scale. He felt that basically the forces that determined history were things like climate and soil and cuisine and material influences on civilizations rather than spiritual ones governing and orchestrating them from above. And Buckle particularly took aim at the habit of sort of writing historical accounts that focused upon great men, heroic figures of history, kings and generals and so forth. And he tended to think of, great men as basically a superstition. The idea that the forces that actually direct human history are not concentrated in individuals, but in masses and the kind of material influences that they're absorbing. So Nietzsche sort of dislikes him for that reason, because Nietzsche, in a sense, still has some use for the concept of great men, though he's going to give us a very, very different version of greatness than the traditional one. For him, the great men of history are not men that, sum up the spirit of the age, but rather men that violently contradict, men whose will to power introduces something completely new and that sends history into a sort of skewed trajectory that couldn't have been anticipated beforehand. So he dislikes Buckle for again, discounting the notion of greatness, but his concept, Nietzsche's concept of greatness, is going to turn out to be, I think, very, very different from the conventional one. But getting back to his discussion of the terminology, this is kind of the first passage where he goes into a little bit of etymological research, focusing on the strange connection between these two modern German words, Schlecht and Schlick, and noting that they're essentially the same word. And we can explain their history by looking back at this originally non-moral meaning attributed to them. Schlecht, or bad, didn't refer to any kind of, immorality or wickedness or moral shortcoming or anything like that. It simply referred to the poor, the class of people that, again, don't have the power to express their power in language, don't have the power to coin terms to exalt their ego, their identity, their status. So they end up getting termed the bad. And he notes that initially this term had no inculpatory implication. There was no moral content. By designating somebody as bad, you're not saying, that they need to be done away with or corrected, or that there's anything wrong with them. You're just saying they don't have any power. They belong to the class that simply has to take their marching orders and has no power to reconfigure their situation rhetorically. And he notes that eventually this situation does change. He had talked about that herd instinct rising up to complicate the duality between good and bad here. And he notes that this happens historically right about the time of the 30 Years' War. I think that's a very interesting detail, because the 30 Years' War, this extraordinarily, unprecedentedly violent conflict that took place in the first half of the 17th century and involved pretty much every nation of Europe, and resulted in, I believe, something on the order of like 8 million deaths. There were whole regions of Germany that had their populations cut in half. Some of the worst, just unprecedented crimes against humanity. Trying to summarize what actually happened in the 30 Years' War is next to impossible, because the first thing you have to do is explain what the fuck was the Holy Roman Empire. And there's literally nobody on earth that's ever been able to answer that question. So trying to summarize the 30 Years' War is a mug's game. But in the broadest strokes, I think we can say that at least one of the things that was going on during that conflict was the replacement of one form of social organization with another, the old feudal regime, the old no-growth hierarchical organization where everybody was born into a fixed class, and that's exactly where you stayed until you died. And all of the wealth is basically just being pumped up to a ruling class that doesn't really know anything to do with it except spend it on, wine, fancy costumes, prostitutes, gambling, all that sort of thing. So this is a very much a very static society where all of the surplus wealth just gets eaten up in enjoyment. And this is being replaced by the capitalist mode of production that involves a new ruling class that arises initially out of the old peasant class, the peasants that are able to accumulate enough wealth to begin going into business for themselves and cultivating new ways of increasing that wealth. And this is a much, much more dynamic society, a new ruling class that is not interested simply in keeping itself amused, but that takes that wealth and instead of spending it on luxury items and self-indulgences, keeps reinvesting it in order to make it grow. Capital now, the kind of limitless growth of capital becomes the dominant force in history. And the 30 Years' War kind of marks the violent installation of that new regime. And it'll keep, there'll be many, many more conflicts that continue to develop the hegemony of capital along those lines. But the 30 Years' War kind of represents the Big Bang. the point where it's obvious that feudalism is no longer tenable and it will continue to decline over the course of the next 200 years. So there seems to be something sort of parallel in that process with the process that Nietzsche talks about, with this herd instinct eventually rising up to take a little bit of control of the language for itself. I feel like there's some kind of a parallel between the new bourgeois peasant class arising out of the old working class to cultivate new modes of wealth making. I don't know exactly what to do with that parallel, but I feel that it's interesting that he specifically identifies the 30 Years' War as the period in which the new moral meaning of the term bad or schlecht begins to come to the fore. Schlecht no longer refers simply to the poor or the working class. It now has a moral content to it. It designates something about a person's moral worth for the first time, he thinks. And we're going to want to keep our ears open for the specific moments of that transformation.